Thank you all for attending this morning. My name is Jeffrey Williams. I'm director here with the North Dallas Chamber of Commerce, and we've got several minutes worth of great topic, great subject matter pertinent to today and our COVID-19 pandemic journey that we're all going through. So welcome to everybody. Want to say again, thank you, Mark Shank and Christie Newkirk, for being our speakers today. Mark Booth for being our moderator. I wanted to throw a shout out to our Business Toolbox Committee for planning this. Great topics, great subject matter, great programming as always. And Ken, would you like to say a few things welcoming everybody also?
I think you did it.
Okay.
Let's rock and roll.
All right. With that, officially, we're going to get to our program, COVID and the top employment law issues for 2021. Most of y'all are business owners or at least decision makers in some type of process having to do with business. And COVID's going to create roadblocks and bumps in the road business-wise. So with that, I want to introduce Mark Booth. He is part of our committee that puts together these programmings, and he is with Team Logic IT. Go ahead and take it away, Mark.
Thank you, Jeffrey, and welcome to today's seminar on COVID and top employment law issues for 2021. I want to first thank our sponsor, Weaver, and then welcome our speakers and subject matter experts, Mark Shank, who is Senior Counsel at McCarthy, and also Christie Newkirk, who's a partner at Carrington, Coleman. We're very grateful to have you to discuss how COVID has affected employment law, but then just everything that we're seeing as far as employment law trends in 2021. So I am Mark Booth. I'm president of Team Logic IT here in Dallas. And I will actually be a co-moderator. Our other co-moderator today is North Dallas Chamber of Commerce member, Anthony McGee. So Anthony, would you talk a little bit about what we have coming up?
Thanks, Mark. People that have been on these calls before, probably familiar with my face, probably more familiar than they want to be, but I couldn't resist the temptation today to help co-moderate this because I've known Mark Shank for a long, long time. And apart from being law partners, I think we're good buddies. People think that lawyers are like swimming in shark tanks, but I have to say, swimming with Mark for 10 years was like swimming with a dolphin. We had a great time together. I'm sorry we're not partners anymore. And I know how highly he values Christie Newkirk, so I think between the two of them, they're going to do some great stuff today.
Thanks. And so before we get started, sorry, go ahead.
Did you want me to introduce the agenda, Mark?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, please do.
Yeah, so today we're going to discuss, we can't avoid COVID, can we? But we're going to discuss some really key COVID employment law issues that are highly pertinent now that we're seeing the end of the rainbow, so to speak. But there are some COVID employment issues that need to be addressed. We're also going to address some top labor law issues and things that employees and businesses should be aware of. We have two great panel members who can talk about those things, and we're going to cover basically 4 topics: the COVID vaccine, employer and employee rights and best practices to consider there. We're going to talk about how remote work trends impact businesses and their staff. We're going to talk a little bit about the America Rescue Plan, and we're going to talk about new trends in employment law and how they will impact you and your business. That's basically it. Over to you, Mark Shank. Mark.
Okay, so Mark. So before we get started, I just wanted to give everybody a little background on the speakers today. So Mark Shank is board certified in civil trial and labor and employment law. He's known as a strategist, arbitrator, mediator, and negotiator, and is regularly asked to serve as an independent investigator. Some of the areas he's helped clients include high exposure contract claims, business disputes, and trade secret claims. And then we also have Christie Newkirk, who has extensive experience helping employers in a variety of HR-related areas, including more recently COVID-19 laws. but also workplace issues, managing employee and executive performance issues, high-risk employment decisions, drafting confidentiality and non-competition agreements, and general preventive advice and counseling. So with that, we wanted to start off. Obviously, COVID-19 is something that's impacted all of us. And Mark, I wanted to ask you if you could sort of kick things off by talking about COVID-19's impact on employment law. Some questions people wonder as employers, is this something that you can mandate? Should you mandate? Exceptions? Can you just kind of run with that question a little bit and let us know what you're seeing out there, please?
I can. By the way, if anybody has a burning question that is topical, let me know. I won't be upset if somebody interrupts me with a question that's topical. But let's start by talking about vaccines. And one of the things to remember is the reason why we got these vaccines to people so quickly is they were authorized by the FDA under what's called an emergency use authorization. That allowed us to bypass the 2-year process of clinical trials. But something that a lot of us don't know, what that means is these vaccines are not fully licensed, and the FDA says, they work fine, but we haven't gone through the process of figuring out what are the long-term effects and that sort of thing. And the question is, why is that important? Well, the law, the statute that authorizes the EAU requires that the FDA inform people of the option to accept or refuse the product. A couple of people jumped out there in the legal profession and said, aha, that means we can't mandate vaccines. Christie and I have looked at this extensively because our clients, it's a fundamental question that our clients ask. And we think that conclusion is not well placed and is a red herring. The better thought process is that if you look further into that law, the law says, look, what you can and can't require employers, what employees to do, what private employers can or cannot mandate is based upon Texas state law. And Texas state law, as you know, is very generally very favorable to employers, gives private employers a lot of leeway. And that's because we are a employment at will state. And so the Supreme Court of Texas has said over and over and over again, we mean it. Texas is an employment at will state. That means that unless there's a specific law, statute that says you can't do something, you can't fire somebody for example, wearing a suit coat or wearing glasses or wearing brown pants, all of which are silly and frivolous, but all of which are authorized because of the basic notion of Texas employment law. We wake up every day and we effectively have a new contract. I agree to work, you agree to pay me. And so that because of that, we've concluded that vaccines can be mandated. Now, there are exceptions to that. There's the medical and religious exceptions, and a little background is necessary. Under the Federal Discriminations Acts, there's a duty to accommodate, and that's a magic word. That's a buzzword that we as employment lawyers use. Accommodate means that we have to take into account the status or beliefs of a person. So under the Americans with Disability Act, if somebody is disabled or has an impairment that is covered by the statute, we have to accommodate that. An example of that is someone who works in front of a computer but has monocular degeneration and has trouble seeing. How do we accommodate that? We put a magnifying glass on the screen. Religious accommodation deals where someone has a deeply held religious belief, practice, or observance, and that's very important language. And as a result, we need to accommodate those. A common place that comes up is people who believe whose Sabbath is on a Saturday or a Sunday, and they do shift work, and the question becomes, can I accommodate them by not making them work on their Sabbath? So how does that relate to the vaccines? What the EEOC said, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, has said, and let me read the language. If an employee cannot get vaccinated because of disability or sincerely held religious belief, practice, or observance, there is no reasonable accommodation possible, then it would be lawful to terminate the employee from the workplace, provided no other rights under EEO laws or other federal, state, and local authorities apply. Well, the exception here swallows up the rule. We will find that it is almost it's highly unusual that you can't accommodate employees. Why? Because the most logical accommodation is that they work remotely, like we're doing right now, and we've proven that to be a reasonable accommodation. Also, accommodation doesn't mean not working, and that's a very important subject that Christie's going to cover also. Accommodation doesn't mean they do less work. What accommodation does is we basically work around the disability or the religious belief so that they can still be as productive as possible. So the next question we should probably ask is, even if we can legally and logically make vaccinations mandatory, should we? And that's a really important question. There's an argument obviously in favor of vaccinations. It makes the workplace safer. It makes everybody more productive. We can it reduces healthcare costs. On the other hand, employees may react poorly to mandatory vaccination policies. And I guess you need to ask yourself, can I get where I need to go with regard to vaccinations by encouragement and persuasion, such that it might be a better route given the potential risks to employee morale? Now, here's an interesting question that when I first came across it, kind of surprised me. Can employers offer incentives to get to their employees to get vaccination? Can they give them bonuses? Those sorts of things. A lot of big employers are doing that. But here's the concern. The argument is that if I give bonuses for vaccinations to my workforce as a whole, is that coercive as to people who can't get vaccinations? People either because of disabilities, they have a condition where their doctor doesn't recommend it, or they have a religious belief against it. Suddenly, we are singling out those people because if they have a reason protected by the law where they can't get a vaccination, and therefore they can't get the bonus. Well, a lot of employers have just said, well, I'm going to do it because it's so important to us as an organization. Others have sort of fallen back on let's see if we can do it without being coercive. Interestingly enough, there's a coalition of business people who've asked the EEOC to weigh in on that, and they've not done that yet. I think that covers it. Let me tell one story. We shouldn't as employers dismiss the notion that certain people have good faith concerns about vaccinations. I know of two instances, one in my volunteer life and another in my work life, where people who are cancer survivors who have recently and are recent cancer survivors either have personal concerns about a vaccination at this time in their life, or their doctors have concerns. And one of this person was actually an HR professional who had was a survivor of metastatic breast cancer. And she said, look, I want to be a good soldier, but right now in my life, I'm very concerned about doing that. All right, Mark, I think that covers the first question.
You want me to take over, Mark Booth? Okay, so Mark Shank, I'm glad you brought up that last point because it was going through my mind as you were talking. I mean, clearly there's a difference between a religious belief and a non-religious belief. You know, and you hear this term anti-vaxxers a lot, and it sounds very pejorative. But there are people who, for good reasons that you've mentioned, are against having a vaccine. But are you saying that under the law, those views are not protected?
I am saying that.
Yeah.
I am saying that. And it's Tony, you've made a very great distinction. Remember that we're employers at will. So we can fire somebody for any reason or no reason, except for a prohibited reason. And being firing somebody for refusing a vaccine because they have a political belief in the private workplace, not in the public workplace, because that's a whole different thing, is not protected.
Yeah, so and that sort of brings us to our next topic, and that's why I was glad you mentioned that. And it's all about safe workplaces, isn't it? You know, people aren't saying you must be vaccinated just because I'm exercising power over you and I can do that. They're trying to have a safe workplace, and it gets very fluid. You know, what steps can an employer take to ensure workplace safety? Can employers relax mask requirements if they require vaccines? Well, the problem with that kind of conversation is in some states you don't have mask requirements. In some you do. In some states, I don't know that anybody's actually required to have vaccination. So it's a lot about what the employer is choosing to do. And so I wanted you to address what steps employers should take to ensure workplace safety. But I want you to kind of also think, if you can, are there any equal protection under the law issues if you have different states imposing or not imposing different policies and requirements?
You know, I've not thought about the equal protection issue. And Tony, you know, it's been a long time since I've taken constitutional law, but I think equal protection requires state action. And in this case, we don't have.
We're talking purely about private employers, but they are following state mandates.
Yeah, and I thought that's where you headed, but let's back up a little bit. One of the things that that drives all the policies that we've seen since the pandemic now 13 months ago hit us when we started reacting to it is a safe workplace. That's why we work remotely. That's why we social distance. That's why we are so fastidious about disinfecting. And so I think we have as a group of employers or managers, I think we know how to do a safe workplace. And so there is an OSHA guidance on the issue, and you can find it by Googling it. But let me read you a summary of the OSHA guidance. The guidelines separate the businesses into 4 zones according to severity of risk. The first 2 zones, known as high exposure risk and very high exposure risk, cover businesses in healthcare and certain related fields. The third zone, known as medium exposure risk, covers businesses in which the employees have significant contact with the general population or other employees. The fourth zone, known as lower exposure risk, covers businesses in which employees have limited contact with the general population and the other employees. That's, to me, a lot of gobbledygook that says basically use common sense. The more you come into contact with the general public, the more you have to take precautions. But again, Tony, I think we are as a collection of employers and a society, I think we know what to do. I think from a compliance point of view, particularly if I'm a multi-state employer, I think managing the various mandates of the various states is complicated and unnecessarily bothersome, but it is where we find ourselves. I'll let a constitutional scholar such as you maybe focus on the constitutional equal protection issues, because from the day-to-day management of your workforce, I think as so long as you take reasonable steps to keep people safe, I think you're doing the right thing. So Tony, you asked about the mask requirements, and I think employers under the March 10th executive order of Governor Abbott, I think they are authorized to relax the mask requirements. And I don't think they're, whether that's good policy is a matter of debate, but I don't think there's any question they are. But I have noticed as I've gotten out and about a bit more after being personally vaccinated, I have noticed that most people have sort of slid in what Governor Abbott calls the personal choice notion, that just because we don't mandate the mask doesn't mean we can't mandate the mask as a matter of statewide policy, but doesn't mean we can't mandate the mask within our business organization. My observation is almost everybody has mask mandates. I see very few businesses who haven't gone ahead and followed the mask mandates, which might tell us a lot about the preferences of the people who frequent the restaurants, stores, shops, bars, music venues, places where we go. All right, Tony, I think that's it for now.
Yeah, I think we just a couple of follow-ups, because we've got a couple of minutes before we turn our attention to Christie.
Yeah, and we've got a couple of questions.
Yeah, so let me ask you a question first, because there was one thing that we wanted to ask you. Are there employers required to pay their employees for the time they spend getting their vaccine?
Yes, I think they are. Assuming that if they mandate the vaccination, then I think under the Fair Labor Standards Act, they have to pay for the time to go to be vaccinated. This gets complicated when someone is doing their vaccination off hours. And in that case, you may not have to pay them. The CDC has said, and I'm not sure that they govern us as employers, but the CDC has recommended that we pay people for being vaccinated, and that we give them sick leave for the time off if they have complications with regard to vaccinations. I think that's relatively intuitive. I think most employers would consider that part of their sick leave policy. The CDC doesn't say you have to give more sick leave than you already have. It just says you have to let people use their sick leave. And I think that's relatively intuitive.
So we have a few comments and questions.
Yeah, we do.
Some of them are sort of more of a kind of a social policy, and I think we can explore them later. But there is one that relates specifically to the legalities. So I'm going to ask you that one right now, and we'll come to the others later. Is there a difference if you are an independent contractor rather than an employee? Does that affect whether the employer has more rights to demand that you be vaccinated?
Well, it changes the dynamic. If somebody is truly an independent contractor, and when I taught at SMU labor law, I always told people, think plumber. When you think independent contractor, think about a plumber. Your toilet's stopped up. The plumber comes in. The plumber brings his truck. He brings his or her tools, fix the toilet, and then they leave. But there's absolutely no problem with Tony, if you own ABC printing services, saying to the independent contractor, you got to wear a mask in here. There's no problem with that.
I thought
Same
you'd say
thing.
that, Mark, but you know, Texas, as you say, Texas is very. There are other states, California, for example, where there's been a lot of development in the law as to the
New York. New York has a
distinction between
yeah.
1099s and W-2s. You know, like Uber drivers. You know, people in the gig economy. In many states, they're being treated as employees, so it could be a more difficult issue in some other states. Would you?
Yeah.
You,
Yeah. Well, I think that's beyond the scope of this program, but there is right now a tremendous uh, uh, uncertainty as to where the lines are as to independent contractors with regard to gig economy workers, Uber drivers, Federal Express drivers, those sorts of things. But like I said,
at least in
in
Texas,
general, in Texas,
yeah.
it doesn't make any difference if you are an employee or a independent contractor.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to hand it back to Mark Booth.
Yep. Thank you for that. So the next thing, Christie, that we wanted to talk about today was remote work. There are people working from home now that never anticipated they would be doing it or certain to this level. So the question I have for you is, what are you seeing as far as trends to allow people to work remotely permanently? And what do employees and employers need to think about? I mean, for example, if you have an hourly employee and they're working from home, how does timekeeping work? Are there tax implications? Would you just kind of walk us through what you're seeing?
Absolutely. And I'll answer your first question in two parts. You know, I would ask, what is not surprising first? You know, what has not been surprising during the pandemic is that our high-tech companies were able to convert to an online only presence and go remote easier, obviously, than any of our other clients. What has been just absolutely surprising to me, though, is my stalwart, we will never allow remote work. It just doesn't work. We're never going for this clients. Went remote rather much more easily than they thought they could, and it worked. And so what I am seeing is a trend not only in the tech industry, but some of my most conservative clients, my banks, my real estate firms, and they are allowing work at home. And they're allowing permanent remote work or kind of some mixed remote work where you get to work 2 days out of the office, 3 days in, or something like that, or you have to come in once a month. So there's definitely a trend in that. And of course, the reasons for it vary. A lot of clients are trying to save on office rent and pushing people home that way. And then a lot of clients are saying, look, we just don't want to have 50 employees in a small bullpen or call center. We want to have people spread out. So a lot of it's for safety right now too. So whatever the reason is, we're definitely seeing a trend and seeing that some of that trend may be permanent. The biggest thing I ask clients to do is to look before you leap with regard to remote work. There are so many little issues, any one of which can kind of hang you up if you don't think about it ahead of time. The first one is the one you mentioned, which is timekeeping. So with your salaried employees, life is pretty easy in this regard. I mean, the largest worry you have is, are they actually working today? Or are they taking a PTO day and just monitoring emails and not telling us? And I think, the way you manage that is figuring out the workflow. Are they producing? Are they keeping with their deadlines, et cetera? But I'll tell you, the hourly workers are a lot harder nut to crack. The kind of from the company's perspective, the biggest thing they're going to want to do is figure out, are our employees working when they say they're going to work? And again, kind of like with the exempt employees' time off or the salaried employees' time off, I think you can reasonably judge that. Having your managers check in with the employee. You send the employee an email at the beginning of the shift or right after lunch or at the end of the day to try to check, are they doing what they should be doing? But I'll tell you, the harder problem that I see that I think flies under the radar screen is that of making sure the employee is actually logging all the time they work. So it's actually the reverse problem. And frankly, I have this problem with my own assistant. If I, on Saturday afternoons, oftentimes I'll sit down and get organized for the week and send her things on my to-do list. And then, Sunday morning, I see emails come back from her and I'm like, no, don't respond now. This is not the time. And I tell her, you have to put that time on your timesheet. If you perform work, you need to be paid for that. So I think, one of the things employers want to keep in mind is the idea of educating employees on what is time worked. One of the other kind of problems lurking out there is for the employers who kind of have what I call the hybrid model, where employees come in some, and then they also work at home some. And there've been some lawsuits about this, so it's something to watch out for because it is flying under the radar right now. And that is, for example, if my secretary takes a phone call from me while she is still at home, and then she commutes into work, and then she works at work, what's her time worked? Is it the time for the phone call plus her time at work? Or is her commute time also included in the time worked? And there's an argument out there that people need to be aware of, that if you start work at home and then you commute in, that commute time is compensable time for which the employee should be paid. So again, none of this is hard, but you need to make sure employees and the managers are educated on this, which means don't start the employee's workday till they get to work. And is my secretary going to ping me for her commute time? Probably not. But if you're a large employer and this is happening with a lot of employees, you become a target for that type of class action. So you just want to stay kind of in the know on those issues. Other than timekeeping issues and paying people properly, the other large issue that's kind of lurking out there under the radar screen is, what are the tax implications of having an employee work remotely? And I'll give you an example. One of my fastest growing tech clients had an employee who wanted to move, I believe it was to Minnesota. It was Minnesota or Michigan, one of those states, during the pandemic, because she was single. She wanted to be close to her family. It was just a temporary move. Well, she moves there. And of course, everybody finds out we can still work remote. This is fine. And then she comes back 9 months later and says, well, I'd like to be here permanently. Well, the client is based in Dallas. She's now in Minnesota. What do we need to think about? And the client's like, well, as long as she's working and everything's good, there's nothing else I need to do. And the analysis we went through with the client is, okay, let's think about this. One, let's look at, do we have to do different withholdings on the employee's paycheck? Because the employee is now a resident of a different state than Texas. There may be a personal income tax. There may be other state withholdings. So we need to think, just from a payroll perspective, do we need to do different withholdings on the check? That's the easy part. The second question I always like to ask is, what is the impact on the employer? What's the tax impact on the employer if the employee moves out of state? And there, the employer is going to need to do an analysis under state law, whether having that employee physically present in the state subjects the employer not only to state income taxes for the employer, but also state franchise taxes. And the answer to that question is going to vary by state because it's governed by state law, but it's going to look at, how many receipts is the employee, what are the receivables that client receives? What's the money that client receives due to that employee's work in the state? Or frankly, work that originates in Texas, but the client is located in Minnesota. So you want to be sure to get your CPA or accountant involved and just think through those issues.
Thank you for that, Christie. Anthony, did you want to talk about the next topic, the American Rescue Plan?
It was just one thing that we wanted maybe have Christie address briefly. It may have been touched a little bit by what Mark already said, but the question specifically is, if an employer has offered the employee the opportunity to work from home during the pandemic, has that now established that remote working situation as a reasonable accommodation going forward for whatever other issues might arise?
That's a great question. And frankly, I think employment lawyers were kind of having a small heart seizure as employees went home, knowing we had spent years arguing that remote work was not a reasonable accommodation and that employees needed to be at work. But the EEOC came out probably about 3 to 5 months ago and and that's the body that the governmental body that governs discrimination law, and in particularly disability discrimination law. And this EEOC said, if you offered remote work during the pandemic, it is not evidence that working in the office is no longer an essential function of the job. So in other words, if you offered remote work, that's not going to hurt your argument that remote work is a possibility for the future for this employee. So great question.
Okay, so let's move on to another topic, Christie, the American Rescue Plan. Can you tell us a little bit about the American Rescue Plan Act from March of this year and what employers need to know about it?
Well, I'll tell you what, this act, I think a lot of us were familiar with it just because it provided the additional stimulus payments, and that's really the big headline grabber that happened. If you haven't done so, I really recommend you go Google Summary American Rescue Plan Act 2021. You will be shocked at the pages upon pages of just highlights that are out there for this act. One of the benefits that went under the radar screen a little bit is the second extension of the tax credits that are available for giving employees voluntary paid sick leave or paid extended Family Medical Leave Act leave. If you guys remember, back in March of last year, Congress passed the Families First Coronavirus Protection Act, and it applied to employers that have under 500 employees. And what it did is it, at that point, mandated that employers in those categories provide up to 80 hours of paid leave if an employee was, say, experiencing symptoms of COVID and was getting tested, or they had to quarantine due to a health official or a government official telling them to quarantine, or they were caring for a child due to a school closure that was caused by the pandemic. That obligation to that requirement that employers provide that paid leave actually ended on December 31st. But what Congress did in January is it said, well, you can voluntarily provide these benefits. And in exchange for getting these benefits, for paying these employees under these circumstances, you get a tax credit against your quarterly payroll taxes in the equal to the amount, the permitted amount that you pay to these employees. So what happened is that was kind of a short-term extension. So Congress has again said, employers, you can continue to voluntarily pay for paid leave under these circumstances. But they also did two things. One is they added additional reasons for the paid leave. So if you are going to get, if an employee is going to get their vaccination, or they're recovering from illness for getting the vaccination, or they're getting COVID testing because their employer required it, or because they've been exposed to somebody but are not experiencing symptoms, they can also ask for this sort of leave. Again, the leave is voluntary. Employers don't have to provide it. But if they do, they get a tax credit up to $200 in some circumstances and $511 a day in other circumstances. So it's really important to get with your accountants and your CPAs and figure out, do I want to do this? Because frankly, a lot of employers want to encourage folks, if you think you're sick, please stay home. And why not get a tax credit for it?
Great, thanks, Christie. And does these tax credits or the giving of accommodations to the employees for extra leave, does that impact COBRA rights in any way?
Yeah, you know, the other provision in the American Rescue Plan Act that, again, flew under the radar screen, and frankly, a lot of employment lawyers didn't figure this out till just recently, is that employers are now required to cover 100% of an eligible employee's cost of continuing their group health insurance under COBRA. If that COBRA eligibility occurs between April 1st of this year and September 30th, 2021. So in other words, if you terminated an employee back in January, but some of their COBRA eligibility period falls within that window, the employer is actually required to pay their COBRA. Now, the good news from an employer's perspective is they do get a tax credit for this money against their quarterly payroll taxes. But I'll tell you, it is going to be super important to get with your carriers and your brokers, because employers have to provide a notice to eligible employees if they're not already on COBRA. And eligible employees includes not only those who asked for COBRA, but those who didn't ask for it, or those who did ask for it, kept it a month or two, and then stopped paying. What's
Okay.
also kind of fascinating about this is the reason for termination is irrelevant as long as it wasn't a termination due to serious misconduct or a couple of other very limited circumstances.
Okay, so that's an impact of the American Rescue Plan that really is not connected to the tax credits and the extra leave. It's a totally different thing, and it can be termination for any reason other than what you said. But what, I mean, you have any thoughts about the rationale for that is?
The idea behind, my understanding of the idea behind it is it's to help workers who are out of work and looking for a job in the middle of a pandemic. The idea is we're going to try to give some relief to these workers who may have more trouble finding a job than they already would have because of the pandemic.
And do the employers who have to take on that obligation receive some kind of help from the government, some kind of tax credit to counterbalance that?
Correct. They get a dollar for dollar tax credit that is against their quarterly tax filings. So
Okay.
the problem from the employer's perspective is you're forwarding the money, but the good news is you get it back on when you file your quarterly tax.
Might be more advantageous to the employer to offer leave
Creative thinking.
rather than fire the employees.
Yeah,
Can I jump in here, Christie?
absolutely.
Yeah. So one of the things that Christie and I dealt with in March, April, and May of last year was the notion of furloughing employees and what that means. Because furloughing actually was a more European term, and what it means is that you're laying somebody off with the current intent that they come back as soon as you have the work for them. And so, Tony, I think that dovetails into what you just said.
Does the only problem I see is that at some point the reduction in hours may trigger a COBRA qualifying event,
That's a really good point.
which means, if you reduce their hours enough and for a long enough period of time, they're going to be eligible for COBRA and flip into this right anyway.
Get it? So that sounds pretty complicated. Got to talk to your CPAs about that.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Mark Booth?
Yeah, so last thing we wanted to talk about is just give each of you a chance to spend a few minutes and tell us what in general are you seeing in new employment law trends? What's on the horizon, what you'd be aware of. So we'll start with Mark, give you a few minutes, and then go over to Christie.
Let me hit 2 points real quickly. Remote working's here to stay. Now, if you're selling hamburgers or you're helping people with shoes, that you can't do that remotely. You can't work in the construction trades remotely. But a big segment of our economy is now used to remote working. There's real trade-offs there that I think have to do with what I'll call the soft side of employment law. But it's really important because if you think about it, your employees are a source of capital we call human capital, and keeping them productive is often one of the biggest challenges we have as managers. And what we've done, not only with working remotely, is we've probably relaxed productivity and accountability, and that will be a real challenge for employers to ratchet that up, which they need to fully harvest their business. So real challenge is productivity and accountability. And the other thing is the mental health aspect. I talk to a lot of people who have Zoom fatigue, who have Teams fatigue, who have remote working fatigue. There's we're mammals, right? We are wired to move in packs. That's on the basis level, that's who we are. And I really think that people have sort of powered through it for a period of time, but they're pretty tired of it. And we do know, just based upon what we read, that the lack of connectivity has caused higher incidences of depression, mental illnesses, inability to do their work in a way they would really like to, and how employers manage that on a going forward basis, I think is very important to the efficient running of their businesses.
Mark, can I add on one point to that? Building on that, I think it's not only the individual employees' kind of mental health, but also the health of the organization, because the statistics clearly show that engaged employees are much more likely to be productive and stay at your company longer. You know,
well, that's the other point I was going to make, which you build on. We connected employees tend to stay with employers longer. And we all know, anybody who's in the business of hiring and recruiting and training employees, there are significant transactional costs with employee movement. And unconnected employees tend to move more, and there's an inherent cost associated with that.
Is anything more about trends?
Yeah, I'll chime in a little bit. I think Mark and we've talked about this before. We're both expecting more claims, especially in your more industrial settings or settings where employees are closer together. I think we're expecting more whistleblower type claims based on, or more reports to OSHA of non-compliance with safety protocols. I think you're going to see a lot of that coming down the pipe at some point. The other thing I've discovered in a lot of the work I do right now is investigation work. So an employee makes a complaint of discrimination or harassment, and I'll come in and just serve as the neutral investigator. What has shocked me during the pandemic, especially during the last 6 months, is how many of those claims are related to sexual harassment. And, you know, I know we're really talking about COVID more, but I would be remiss if I did not mention kind of the increase of these sorts of claims. And I'm not sure if it's because management is not on site, employers are not taking time to train, or managers are not watching as closely as they used to because maybe they have more on their plate. But I think it's something to be aware of and be watchful of, and make sure your complaint procedures are good so you can, you know, if there's a problem, you know about it fast and you can fix it.
Thanks, Christie. Well, we do have a couple of questions, a few questions in the chat. We wanted to leave them to the end. They kind of arise out of things that you've said so far. And we have a very pertinent question from Carola that addresses the issue of requiring vaccinations. But she has a very particular issue that I don't think, Mark, you addressed.
No.
So I'm gonna ask her if she...
Carola and Larry have a similar question.
Well, I wanted to ask Carola to get online and put her question to you directly.
Okay.
Okay, so this is a little bit of context before and my thoughts. I might be wrong in my thinking here, so that's why I'm asking. So it's my understanding that it is an emergency use authorization vaccine, which means that the testing has not been done like they normally would have done beforehand, which categorizes it as an experimental vaccine. So under the Nuremberg law from World War II, because it's an experimental vaccine, I as a citizen do not have the option to take it or not take it. Okay, so from my understanding for what you said is Texas state employment law supersedes that. So if I, as a person, fear vaccine injury from the vaccine and maybe down the future, because it is still considered an experimental vaccine, this is the first vaccine for coronavirus. How is that protected? I mean, can I sue the employer if he makes me take a vaccine to keep employment?
Yeah, let's take that question and let's dovetail that to Larry. Is that Fauci? Is that how you pronounce your last name?
Fusey.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, he says we have a herd of rare cases where people are harmed by vaccines. What's a business's liability if you require a medical side effect? And what about the long-term issue that at this time is unforeseen? So let me tie those two together because I think they're really good questions. And I'll admit, I don't think we know the answers to them completely. I believe that Texas employers have the right to mandate vaccines, okay? That doesn't mean there aren't consequences from that. And as I've told you earlier, one of the consequences is people who fear the vaccines for legitimate reasons that are not a medical condition, not a diagnosed medical condition that meets the ADA, or not based upon religious beliefs, probably are not protected and probably can't sue their employer for mandating vaccines. Now, having said that, you should have gleaned from what I said earlier that I'm not a fan of mandated vaccines for some of the reasons that others have expressed. And my personal view, and the view I share with my employers, is I don't recommend mandatory vaccines because of some of the concerns expressed, but also because of the general employment morale. I'm a big human capital guy. I'm a big believer that just because Big Brother can do something, big employer can do something, doesn't mean they should do something. So let's segue from that to Larry's question. Theoretically, the fact that somebody has workers' comp insurance ought to protect the employer from liability, but it's theoretic. And I could see a court saying, no, this isn't about whether you get hurt, bending over and picking up a shovel, etc. I could see a court saying, they haven't yet, that this is outside the course and scope of what workers' comp is supposed to cover, and therefore there might be liability. Another reason why I don't recommend mandatory vaccines.
Hey, Mark, can I follow up on that?
Sure.
We talked earlier about whether employers have to pay their employees for the time they're being vaccinated. So you send your employee off to be vaccinated, you pay them while they're doing it. They get a vaccine, they sustain an injury. I'm not an employment lawyer, you know that, but does that, and what if the employer decides, wouldn't it be great to have my employees that aren't already vaccinated in the office? I can get a medical team to come in and get them all vaccinated. Other circumstances in which your analysis of whether workers' comp would apply may vary?
Well, Tony, that's a great question. We have for years tolerated employer-sponsored influenza vaccines and other vaccines. Now, the difference is it wasn't under an emergency use authorization. And I can't go any further in my analysis because no court and no state agency has answered the question as to liability for a mandatory vaccine. I will say that it is a legitimate concern, but I'll temper that by saying we spend as employment lawyers and as employers, we spend our entire life tempering, engaging in cost benefit analysis. If I do this, then I'm more likely not to be I'm less likely to be in trouble with the EEOC, but I might be in more trouble with OSHA.
Would you object if I took a second opinion and ask Christie what she thinks?
Yes, I want to hear what Christie says.
No, I'm going to side with Mr. Shank on this. I have one client out of all of my clients who is mandating vaccines, and everybody else, I've said, let's dip our toes in slowly. And I think the thing I remind clients of is just because your viewpoint is in favor of vaccines, you've got to remember there is a wide variety of opinions on this vaccine right now. And so I tell clients, for a few months, let's just see what happens. And maybe those folks who are nervous about the vaccine will start to read things or see things that make them feel more comfortable. But let's not force people to do something that's scary to them at this point. I just think
Yeah.
that the recipe for them going to a plaintiff's lawyer and creating a claim.
Yeah. The other thing is, I just saw when I was preparing today that Governor Abbott has this week issued a executive order that says if you're either a state agency or receiving state funds, you cannot mandate vaccines. You can't even require them to show you, your employees, to show you the vaccination card. So I've literally got a pending question with a client about that I'm going to have to talk about this afternoon. But that's important to know.
Mark, I think we've got another question in the chat. Mark Booth, that is. From Jenny.
So Jenny King asked a question for the connectivity issue between workers and workplace. How will office trends, hybrid work schedules, working from home, et cetera, is there any impact that we should be aware of as far as employees changing jobs or job hopping? I mean, how's that all going to be impacted?
I'll let Christie take that one.
Yeah, I will tell you, I think this is one of the biggest questions, is figuring out which of those office trends actually works. And I think it's going to vary by employer and by industry. But I tell you, if you have not spent some time surfing Harvard Business Review's website and looking at the articles on all these different trends, it is time well spent. And I think the key is going to be finding what trend matches your workforce best, because we all know you get those creative ideas, those random thoughts that you happen to pass on at the water cooler, that those are the big ideas and sometimes the secret sauce of the company. So I think it's going to be critical to explore what's out there, but also engage in some trial and error. Know that you're going to try some stuff and it's not going to work, but then keep going and keep evaluating and keep looking for different options. That is going to be critical for the remote work.
Jenny, do you have a follow-up question? We've got about 30 seconds left.
No, I was typing actually. I was going to say, to the point about vaccines and mandating them or not, I was on a call last night. We were talking about herd immunity of 85%. And so as you all are leaders in industry, please continue to offer education to your employees. And if we at UT Southwestern or any of our peers out in Dallas can be helpful, we're all out there trying to share about the vaccines and help people understand. It's so complex. And if I didn't work there, I know I'd be trying to figure out, what all this means, but if I didn't work at a healthcare place. So if there's something that we can do for you, please let me know. I'll put my email in the chat. We're doing a big public event at the end of this month with UTD, and we hope it's a 12 to 1 p.m. thing. And I'll share that with Ken and Jeffrey. And we invite you and your employees to come and just listen and ask questions. We have 2 infectious disease doctors talking about this issue, and we have to get everyone vaccinated, but it'll be interesting to see when we start mandating it.
Thanks, Jenny, for that comment. We're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Thanks for the great questions from the audience, the participation. Thank you to our panelists and our moderator. Christie, you and Mark have done and Mark Booth and obviously Tony McGee have done a fantastic job of trying to shed some light on an ever-changing landscape. I think at best, caution is always a good word right now. Want to thank our sponsor, Weaver, for this Toolbox offering. And wanted to also remind everyone that at the end of the year, the North Dallas Chamber of Commerce will be giving a donation in the name of both of our speakers to the Austin Street Shelter. So not only do these programs obviously benefit those that are attending, but by coming on and being subject matter experts, you are also adding to the success of great nonprofits in the Dallas area. So thank you for that.